Being mindful is the practice of maintaining a non-judgmental state of heightened or complete awareness of one's thoughts, emotions, or experiences on a moment-to-moment basis, which can be extremely important while trying to understand and learn more about mental health. So let me welcome you to Mindful Thoughts. My name is Deloris, and I feel like my mission in life is to help break down those barriers around mental wellness by sharing personal stories, tips, and confessions of mental health to help us shine a light on mental wellness. So what are we waiting for? Let's dive in. Hey guys, today I want to discuss triggers. And the reason I want to discuss triggers is because I feel like we don't talk about triggers enough. Most often, we discuss and focus on what happens to a person after they're triggered, which in most situations is much harder to address with somebody who's already been triggered than if we were able to address the triggers before the trigger happened. Now, everybody, I feel like in life, is triggered by something. There's something that somebody says or something somebody does, something you see on TV. Scrolling through social media, there could be a picture or content that is created or a video that triggers you. And for a lot of us, I don't think we recognize them at first as triggers, because at first we see something or we hear something, and maybe sometimes we're not automatically reacting to it or feeling a certain way. But then down the line, at some point, you start to feel bad about yourself, or you question stuff about yourself. And that's because earlier you were triggered by something, but you didn't know you were triggered by it. So today I want to talk about what triggers are, how we form triggers, understanding the difference between triggers, ways we can help ourselves and others with triggers, and the reason people do trigger warnings. So let's start off with what a trigger is. A trigger is a stimulus that escalates a reaction. In the context of mental illness, a trigger is often used to mean something that brings on or worsens symptoms. This often happens to people with a history of trauma or who are recovering from a mental health illness, self-harm, addiction, and or a eating disorder. When someone has a history of any of these issues, being unexpectedly exposed to imagery or content that deals with that history can cause them harm or relapse. So overall, most of us would like to be more understanding and being able to identify and work on those triggers so we can be empowering and more effective, especially in comparing to supporting someone after they have been triggered. So one of the things that I think about when most people that are probably triggered nowadays is social media. You follow accounts or you follow people because you like them, but sometimes you don't realize that their content is triggering for you. So say you're someone who wants to lose weight. Well, if you're following all these people who are eating healthy and working out all the time, maybe at first you are inspired, but then over time, if you're not taking care of yourself or you're not working out the way you think you should be, or you have issues with the way you look at your body, then that could be triggering for you over time and cause you to have these feelings about yourself and to make you feel like you're not doing what you should be doing or there's something wrong. And you don't realize at first that following those accounts can make you feel that way, but then over time it does. Or you're someone who is suffering from depression or anxiety or any of the range of mental health illnesses, and you see somebody who is talking about their journey and they're in such a good place and they're doing all this stuff for themselves and they feel really good, but you're just in the beginning or in the thick of it, and that can make you question the things you do for yourself or the way you're handling things, and it can make you overall feel bad about yourself. When one of the things too I want to say is that when you see somebody talk about their journey, they're usually in a good place. So you need to realize that where they're at now is not where they were at before. So when you see that though, you get triggered by the fact that you're not where you think you should be. So it's important for us to talk about the triggers before they happen, so then we can understand why we're triggered in the first place, and then we can put in the steps to prevent us from being triggered from that. Or if we see something that comes up that might trigger us, how we can cope with that and deal with it instead of it getting worse and worse over time. And it's just important for us to learn the triggers, learn what we can do to help the triggers, so in the future the triggers aren't so bad. So you might be wondering, well, how do triggers form in the first place? Well, our senses play a significant role in forming memories. One theory proposes that trauma-related triggers may feel so intense because our senses are highly involved. When we experience trauma, our brain tends to store the surrounding sensory stimuli to memory. Then, when we encounter these sensory triggers later on, the brain may reactivate the feelings associated with the trauma. In some cases, we might not even be conscious of why we are afraid or upset. But whether it is a one-time event or a series of trauma events, trauma affects each person differently. In fact, the same event could cause two people to respond differently. One can accept while the other develops PTSD. So that's why when something happens to you as a child, and then later on in life, you're upset about something or something makes you afraid, you might not be conscious of where that came from or why that's there, because a lot of times when you're little and something traumatic happens to you, you store it away in a part of your brain that you don't almost have activity to say, I'm forgetting it, I'm putting away. And that's why for a lot of people, when they go to therapy, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about your childhood. And it brings up these memories and these events that you don't remember as a kid, or you think back to your childhood and there's gaps in your childhood, but that's almost because something traumatic happened and you didn't want to deal with it, and you still don't want to deal with it, so you've stored it away. But then when you see something that activates that, those feelings associated with that trauma come up, and most time you are unaware of why you feel the way you feel about it. And they always say that, like, if you're in a family and there are multiple children and something traumatic happens, each child is going to react differently to that trauma. One child could accept it while the other one thinks they accepted it and moved on, but then later in life something happens and they're triggered by it, and they don't know why they're triggered by it until they talk about it and uncover what had happened to them earlier. This is something that could happen to people that are in bombings, people that are in war, people that, are around shootings. These traumatic things happen to you and you find ways to cope with them, but sometimes you think you accept what has happened until, you hear about it on the news or you see something on social media, and then you are triggered by that, which you're afraid, and it upsets you. And at first you might realize, thinking to yourself, why does this make me feel the way I feel? And that is because you went through something and it was traumatizing to you, and you thought you coped with it and you thought you got over it, but really it just stored away in your brain, and now it's being reactivated by you seeing that piece of content. And that's why social media sometimes can be so damaging to people, because depending on who you're following and what you're looking at, you might not realize that you went through something earlier in life that now seeing what somebody's talking about or what somebody's discussing is going to trigger you in a way that you didn't realize that you would be triggered by. So it's very important to write down when you're triggered and why it makes you feel the way you feel, and then try to figure out what that could be connected to, so then in the future when you come in contact with content or imagery that could potentially trigger you, to not consume that, or, and have in place these coping mechanisms to, help you get through it, so then it doesn't hit you so hard that it's like consuming you and taking over your day or taking over that moment and you can't function. So let's understand why triggers happen. So with understanding triggers, there are 4 different areas that people can be triggered in. There's external triggers, internal triggers, trauma triggers, and symptom triggers. Now, external triggers are triggers that are thinking senses, like sounds, sights, smells, textures, that escalate responses based on past experiences. Again, this could be like a car backfiring. Somebody has a trigger from that, from like bombs. Somebody driving past somewhere and hearing shooting. That could be a trigger. Anything that goes with your senses is the external of something that is based on the past experience that, makes that response come up. And then you have the internal triggers, which is the strong feelings that arise based on past experiences. So your external, you see something and you smell something or you hear something that triggers it. And then you have the internal ones that are those strong feelings of being upset or afraid that come up when you see or hear or smell those outside external things. And then you have trauma triggers, which are strong feelings that arise based on past traumas. So something that happened to you that was traumatic, you experience that again, that is your trauma trigger, because you've already gone through something and now that experience is coming back to you, like it's almost like PTSD happening to you again. And then you have symptom triggers. A psychological change can trigger larger mental health issues. So for some, a trigger might cause a physical response like heavy breathing, sweating, or crying. For some, a trigger can escalate an emotional reaction like thinking I'm being attacked. And then for some, a trigger can cause harm or relapse. After experiencing a trigger, a person may have big negative feelings such as overwhelm, powerlessness, and fear. These feelings can be determined to mental health and are often a challenge to effectively address after they arise. The behavior that emerges after a trigger can range from relatively minimal, like crying, to serious, like acts of violence. Someone exposed to a trigger may experience impaired judgment or awareness. This is why, again, I'm going to say it is so important to learn about triggers and learn about what triggers you, because you can have these feelings around something that happens, and then let's say you have a trauma, right? So you have this trauma of a strong feeling that arises, but it only arises because you've heard something or seen something that triggers that. So then you have this internal trigger of feeling upset or, angry or whatever symptom that comes along with that trigger. And then you start to feel those symptoms of it. Well, I'm being attacked, or you start crying, or you feel overwhelmed. And you have fear. And again, some people with behavioral wise can cry and feel a certain way, but then for other people, it's trying to defend yourself because you feel like you're under attack, so then you become violent. You start throwing things, or you start saying things to somebody that you love that you didn't mean. So I think that if you could understand and go through each different 4 layers of these triggers and say, okay, is there something externally that makes me be triggered? Is there something I see? Is there something I hear? Is there a certain smell? Something I touch that brings back that memory? Okay, Now I know what that is. Okay, so how internally does that make me feel? Does it just make me have, strong feelings from the past experience? Or is it a trauma? Is it something that I went through that made me feel this way? Okay, identify that. And then you could also identify the symptoms that come along with that. How do I feel? Am I having an emotional reaction to this? It's really good to, almost pinpoint all these, so then when something comes up like this again, you can pinpoint why you feel this way. If you could say these triggers are associated with this event or this experience or this traumatizing thing that happened to me, then you will know when those things come up or when you see something, how you can react in a way that won't be as harmful as it might have been in the past. The main thing is learning what the trigger is and then learning how to cope with that trigger later on and in the future, so then it's not so bad and you don't feel that same way. Or maybe at first you act very intensely about it, but then over time when you learn more about it, you could end up just like crying about it or having these minimal reactions than having these big reactions. So let's talk about ways to help someone who gets triggered. We should be curious. Learn to engage in difficult situations with a focus on maintaining a positive relationship. Learn what is triggering for those around you and try to avoid causing pain. Respect their right to not share or share on their own time. If you have somebody that you know is triggered by something, you don't want to do something or say something that's going to trigger them. So it's important for you to learn what their triggers are, so then you can help prevent yourself from doing that trigger to them, or to help them prevent from being triggered from whatever comes up. And don't, make them share what is the trigger or what might be wrong. When somebody loves you and when they feel like they can trust you, they will open up. You just have to wait and be patient. I know that can be hard because you want to know how to help them, but when you push them and push them and push them, that could be a trigger for them to feel like I'm being attacked or I'm being misunderstood. And then that'll push them further away from you than it would if you just kindly say, when you're ready to talk about this, I'm here, just let me know. So we can be curious about how to help people and understand what triggers them. But when they aren't ready to, open up about it, you know what, that's okay. You let them deal with it, and in their own time, they will open up to you. The next one is to be empathetic and listen without judgment. Be a safe place for those around you. Avoid taking another's behavior personally, nor making negative judgments about someone's feelings or behavior. We need to be empathetic. We need to listen without judgment. When someone decides to open up to you, it's because they trust you and they feel like they can tell you things. But when you act negatively or have your own thoughts about it, then those people will stop sharing with you because they don't want that negativity or that reaction. So something that's really good for you is to acknowledge what they're going through, but to have no judgment. If they have a certain behavior that comes up, don't take it personally. It's just the way they feel and how they're coping with things, and try to, be more understanding and learning. And even if you don't understand, you tell them, like, please tell me more about that so I know how to help, or I know what I might be doing that triggers you, so then in the future it'll be easier to communicate with that person how they're feeling and what they're going through. The next thing is to maintain good boundaries. Boundaries help everyone be clear on expectations, which adds security and predictability. Always respect that person's boundaries. If they're not ready to talk, they're not ready to talk. If they want to talk about certain things but not other things, then let them do so. But you need to have good boundaries with yourself and with that person, so then those boundaries aren't crossed, and then that person can't feel like they can come to you with how they're feeling and what they're going through. They need to feel safe, and when they feel safe, they will open up. The next one is helping with coping. Ask about strategies that work for that person to relax and to take care of themselves. Encourage more time spent on self-care activities. Encourage them to do something that, makes them happy, brings them joy, makes them calm, helps them, relax. Because when a trigger happens, it's intense and it feels a certain way. So you want them to know that they have a way to relax and self-soothe themselves, so then they feel better. And the last one is to use trigger warnings. If you develop content, providing a trigger warning before potential triggering content provides time for people to prepare, or if they need to opt out. So the purpose of trigger warnings is that trigger warnings are designed to warn trauma survivors about potential disturbing content. No doubt, these warnings may help certain people with PTSD, particularly if they're in a vulnerable state in that given moment. So reading about triggers, some people say that trigger warnings are more harmful than good, because you're putting it out there that you're talking about something triggering and that person is already triggered by it. But really overall, we put trigger warnings out to tell people this content could be triggering for you, so this allows you time to either prepare yourself for it or to opt out and not look at the content, watch the video, whatever kind of content it is. It allows that person to say, I'm preparing myself for it, so I'm not triggered by it, or I'm just not going to watch it, so I'm not triggered by it. So as people are back and forth on it, I think I'm more on the side as it's helpful for people to know if something's going to be triggering for them, or if they see something or the content is triggering, to know that the information that is provided could be triggering for somebody. And this lets you know, again, that either you can prepare yourself for it so you're not as triggered, or you can just not, consume the content that somebody puts out, and you can just opt out and skip it. So let's talk about some coping mechanisms for those who get triggered. There are many possible coping strategies you can try, but all should focus on reducing the impact of the trigger and strengthening the emotional reactions. Trial and error can help each person determine what works best for you. Different coping strategies may work for different triggers and emotions. So the first one is to learn to identify. Consider reactions to past triggers. Who or what was involved? Where, when, and why did it take place? Observe patterns and obvious signs of risk to prevent a similar solution. Number 2 is to plan to address. Create a plan to address the trigger and emotional response. Talk to your doctor to let them know how to best help you when the triggers happen. Be sure to carefully address the triggers that occur repeatedly, because each time they do, the emotional reaction will be greater. The next is to try problem-focused coping. Confront your stressors directly, or try to find a solution to those stressors. The next one is try emotional-focused coping. When you cannot eliminate or avoid a trigger, focus on regulating your reaction to a sensory, which may help reduce a sensory's impact. Something that I think about this is when you have a family member or somebody in your life that you have to be around, but the things they do or the things they say trigger you. What you could do is confront that trigger head on and say, why is this person triggering me? What they're saying is triggering me. Why is this happening? And then you can, communicate with that person that is triggering you. Because a person triggering another person is often unintentional about it. So have an open and calm and understanding dialogue with them and let them know the impact it has on you to clear any misunderstanding and consider solutions. Be willing to work with them. If they refuse to act sensitively, it may be best to set clear boundaries. There are a lot of people who have people in their lives that do this, and they set boundaries, and those people overstep those boundaries and they still feel a certain way, and then they kind of just have that person opt out of their life. You no longer communicate with that person, you no longer talk to that person. And for some people, it can be hard when this person is a family member, but sometimes you need to sit down with them and say, look, this is what's triggering me, this is what's happening, and if you keep repeatedly doing this, I'm no longer going to come to family events when you're here. I'm no longer going to communicate with you. I'm going to kind of just opt you out of my life. And if you don't want that, then me and you need to work on a solution so we can be around each other. And that can be really hard, but it's really important for you to do, so then you feel safe in your environment and around the people that you're with, so you're not continuously triggered. And that person might unintentionally not be aware of what they're doing or what they're saying that is triggering or is making you feel that way. And when you bring it up, they're like, oh gosh, I won't do that anymore, I'm sorry. So it's important to, just let them know, be clear about it, so there's not a misunderstanding and there's a way of, getting these solutions for these problems, so both of you can be wherever both of you are. And again, if they, say no or refuse, then you just let them know. Then I just won't come to certain things when you're around, and I just got to do what's best for me. And some people might be upset, but you have to do what's going to be best for you and what's going to make you feel better. And sometimes if that's upsetting other people or, opting out of other people's lives, that's what you need to do for yourself. Another thing you can do is to find the right therapy. Specific types of therapy have shown effective in addressing triggers, and support groups can also help you feel less alone. The last one you can do is reality check your thoughts. To minimize the escalation of thoughts and feelings, it may be helpful to reality check thoughts to assess their reasonabilities. A few ways to do this include: check facts. What is undisputably true? And do the facts support your interpretations? Number 2 is to consider cognitive distortions. Identify faulty or inaccurate thinking, perceptions, or beliefs. Number 3 is to reframe. Reshape automatic negative thoughts into positive ones. And number 4 is proportionality. Ask yourself, is the reaction disproportionate to the trigger? So first, let's check the facts. Okay, is it true? Or are you trying to support something that isn't true overall? So it's one of those things to check to see if what you're feeling is true, or if you think you should be feeling the way you're feeling. And then number 2 is to identify the faulty or incorrect thinking, perspectives, or beliefs. So is this something that comes up that's incorrectly thoughts that come up? Or is it something that over time was a belief that you should feel the way you're feeling? And then you need to try to reframe how the thoughts come up. When something happens, usually it's a negative thought, but how do we change that into positive ones? So something that makes me think about this is, why is this happening to me? Well, it's not happening to you. So instead of saying, why is this happening to me, say, what can I learn from this? What can I do to make this not happen again? So just twisting that and reframing that can help you overall not have those negative thoughts about that event or that trauma that comes up. How can this help me learn what I need to do for myself in the future? And then the last one is proportionality. The quality to correspond in size or the amount to something else. So it's almost saying the way you're reacting to it, is the reaction needed, or are we having a larger reaction than we should be having? So it's saying to yourself, going through this checklist and saying, first, am I checking the facts? am I considering the cognitive the distortions? Can I reframe it? And what am I having a bigger reaction than I should be having? And again, look for trigger warnings. Trigger warnings can help alert you to triggering material that you might be consuming that might have your thoughts or have your feelings feeling a certain way, and practice self-care. Prioritizing your mental health can help build resilience against potential triggers. Practice mindfulness, meditation, deep breathing exercising, or journaling. While it can be difficult to control triggers, those who experience them can learn from past experiences, apply what they learn, and limit the risk of them being re-triggered. Avoid only focusing on what happens after a trigger. Also focus on what can be done beforehand. Each time a person is triggered, it is a learning opportunity that can help manage reactions in the future. If a person cannot control the trigger fully, they may be able to limit the emotional reaction to it before it becomes problematic and harder to address. They might be able to prevent the trigger by preparing for it. There is always something you can control. Anything that offers a little control over mental health can help keep us well. This is why I thought it was so important to talk about triggers, because while dealing with a mental health illness, it is important for you to identify what makes you feel the way you feel, what content makes you feel the way you feel, what people say make you feel the way you feel, passing a certain place, smelling a certain smell, why these feelings and thoughts come up, and how we can identify them for the future. Because we need to avoid only focusing on what happens after the trigger happens. We need to also focus on what can be done beforehand so that trigger does not happen. When you have a loved one where you know a certain smell or a certain sight or a certain piece of content is going to trigger them, it can help you and somebody else help you avoid that trigger from happening. So the more we learn about triggers and the more we realize why we're triggered by it, then the easier it's going to be overall for us not to be triggered by it. That was like for me, I learned that certain phrases or certain things that were said to me triggered me. So how did I avoid these triggers? I told that person, this is what's triggering me, just so you know, please don't do that again. And that person was like, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do that. I will practice on not doing that in the future. Or with social media, when I found something that triggered me, like following an account or seeing certain things, then I learned to unfollow them and not consume that content so I'm not triggered by it and I don't feel bad about myself. The more we learn about triggers and the more we learn how to cope with those triggers, the easier over time it's going to be. So I'm hoping after this episode, you can learn more about what you need to do for yourself when triggers come up, or how to identify those triggers before they happen so you know how to cope with them in the future. At the beginning, like we said, we don't talk about triggers enough. And again, most of the time we are so focused on discussing like how we can help the person after they've been triggered. And again, when somebody's triggered, it can be harder to address how they're feeling or their thoughts around it because they're deep into that trigger. So I think it's important to, before the triggers happen, identify why they might be happening and then understand how we can prevent it from happening. Easy to, talk to somebody after they've been triggered. Okay, why are you feeling this way? What was triggering and all this stuff. But if we could learn to sit with somebody and say, okay, let's talk about things that might trigger you. Let's discuss why you're triggered or why you feel this way. So then we can prevent that from happening, or we can prevent you from having that reaction. That's why therapy can be very helpful if you have a therapist that helps with triggers. Because they could say, okay, what's your trigger? going past, this park because it reminds me of something that tragic. Okay, how do we prevent that? Maybe they say, drive past there, or maybe walk past there once a week and think with yourself, why is this triggering? And how do I, take those negative thoughts and spin it around? Or maybe with people that are in, bombings or shootings, the coping mechanisms for them would be the loud noises of, okay, when you hear those loud noises, what are something soothing you can do for yourself to say, I'm safe, I'm okay, I'm not in trouble, or I'm not in danger? Because it can be hard to, do that when it's so traumatizing. But if we learn that, that's the trigger, this is what I do when the trigger happens, and this is how I self-soothe, or this is how I talk to somebody about it, then again, in the future, it can be easier when that trigger comes up. Working on your triggers is important. Understanding your triggers is important. And learning ways to deal with them is important. Now, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a lot of work, but the more we work on it, and the more we talk about it, and the more we share, the easier it'll be for the people around us, for our doctors, for our therapists to understand what we need for ourselves and what we need from them to help us move forward. Like I said, I have spent years diving deep into what triggers me and why it triggers me and why it makes me feel the way I feel. And the more I identify what is triggering me and why it makes me feel the way I feel, the more I'm able to learn what I need to do for myself in the future, what I need to not consume, what I need to not be around, the kind of, environment that I need to be in, that I need to be in an environment that feels safe and secure to me, not one where I'm anxious and I'm overloaded. And the more you learn, what personally triggers you, again, the easier it's going to be in the future, and the easier you're going to be able to understand, and the easier you're going to be able to identify why that triggered you, why you feel the way you feel, and move forward. And I think maybe even journaling about it when it happens, this is the trigger that happened, this is how I felt, and then saying, why do I feel this way? What could this be connected to? So then when that comes up again, you can look back and say, okay, this is the same trigger as this one, and these are the same feelings, or maybe you're having different feelings, but then you can connect it back to something to say to yourself, okay, this is what I did last time to make me feel better. Let's try that again. And that could also help you in the future as well. And again, if you're somebody who has somebody in your life that is triggered, maybe making mental notes or writing stuff down, okay, this is when they get triggered, this is how they react, this is how I can help them, can help people so much more, and help you and help them understand what's going on, and can help you and also help them get through it in the future. This is why I think triggers is such an important topic. And again, I think it's important for everybody to learn what's triggering to them and learn how to, cope, understand, identify, and then work on how to prevent those triggers, or even if you can't prevent them, to figure out just how to almost self-soothe yourself when those triggers occur, and to work on a list of things you can do for yourself when you are triggered. So I hope this episode was helpful for anybody out there, and if it was, please drop a comment on YouTube, the YouTube video, or come over and let me know that this was helpful for you on Instagram. I'll even put a question box in Spotify if you listen over there. And like always, I want you guys to remember that you are never alone and that I love you. Thank you so much for listening to another episode. And you know what would be so amazing? If you shared, left a comment, and liked this episode. Any type of support and love for this podcast is going to help it grow more and more every day. I'm so grateful to have you here, and I'll talk to you again soon.